Last but not least, I'd like to call up Hall of Fame member, former basketball coach Sonny Lane, who present the award to the first friend of Wakefield High School Athletics, Ernie Donahue.
Thank you very much, Steve, and the entire committee for a fantastic program here this evening. One of the finest honors that I have ever had is being able to introduce Ernie Donahue here this evening. Before doing so, I just want to mention what a magnificent evening this is and has been for all of you inductees, your families, and your friends. You are certainly, every one of you, most deserving of your awards. Most people that are inducted into Hall of Fames are chosen because they excel or further the cause in a particular sport as a coach, athlete, or booster. In Ernie Donahue, we have an individual who has helped out not one sport, but many and any that has needed support. There are very few programs in Wakefield that Ernie has not helped behind the scenes. I emphasize behind the scenes because that's the type of person that Ernie is. He didn't care whether a team was 20-0 or 0-20, he would support that team. There is no one that is more loyal to Wakefield athletics and cares about kids than Ernie Donahue. I'll bet there are very few people sitting here in this room that are aware that Ernie and his wife Jean have taken in 24 foster children over the years. In addition, he has helped raise 6 beautiful children, all fantastic people, and a direct reflection of the man. In basketball, we called him the general manager. He helped in every single facet of the program. His attendance record is second to none as far as watching boys and girls soccer, boys and girls basketball, tennis, cross country, baseball, football. He's that familiar face in the crowd. He goes, he watches, he roots for, and he supports them all. He's without a doubt the #1 fan for all sports. He'd even take the time to follow Joe Burke in his Special Olympics basketball games wherever they were played. Why? Because he truly wanted to. For years, he ran the concession stands here for the basketball games, the soccer games, and any youth program that there was to be had in the community. He's an unbelievable giver of time and energy for the sake of kids, and he never ever has asked for anything in return for himself. He's a man that sees the best in others, particularly the underdog and the less fortunate. There's a bandwagon saying, you've heard it before, and it says, everybody loves a winner. Well, Ernie Donahue is a man that always stepped back and let kids and coaches have the spotlight during winning times. But when a youngster missed a shot at the end of a game, or a team lost a heartbreaker, he was one of the few and one of the first to reach those people and say, that's okay, we still love you kids. You kids are terrific. There never has been, and there never will be in the future, a more deserving individual to be represented as a crusader for all kids in all sports in Wakefield. He is without a doubt the most caring and unselfish man that I have ever met. I speak for many athletes and many coaches in congratulating and presenting 1992 Hall of Fame inductee Ernie Donahue.
telling you, right? I think it's about 4 pages. That was. Well, pretty well much. You know what I want to say? I want to thank you people. I love those guys. Brad, Sonny and Dick. I've been part of, I hope, their family. Brad's 2 children are part of my family. I wish they had been able to come. Their mother was sick, and Judy. I met 2 presidents, I found out this year. Scotty is president of the sophomore class, and then Judy says, well, Beth is president of the freshman class. I said, she can't be, she's a girl. So, one lesson I learned. Great people. The one is I've been associated with, Sonny Lane, Dick Kelly. I mean, it's easy. It really hasn't been that hard, Sonny. I love them all. Thank you. I forgot my family. And my wife, Jean, she puts up with a lot.
In closing, I just wanted to take one moment and congratulate all the recipients tonight, and also to let everyone here know that there will be a permanent display of all the recipients. We'll have a shadow box, as I mentioned earlier, up in the upper deck, so to speak, at the Charbonneau Fieldhouse. And basically that's it. I hope to see everyone back here next year.
TV contract, they have the rights to the Final Four in basketball for the next 10 years, and the cost of the contract was $1 billion. So I don't think people realize sometimes that why if a game scheduled at 10 o'clock, it's not because the presidents and the professors would prefer that, or even the coaches would prefer that their students are studying and the athletes are studying, but it's really TV that controls everything, especially nowadays in the sports world. But I thought I'd give you a little bit of insight into how things work. With regard to the scheduling, for instance, people complain that we play these cream puffs early in the season. And you have to realize that there's 10 teams in the Big East, so we have 18 league games against Howard, Syracuse, Georgetown, Seton Hall, Villanova. And the whole aim is to try to get into this NCAA tournament at the end of the year. So without being careful, you can schedule yourself easily in and out of this NCAA tournament, which is one of the big money-making situations that you run into. And that's one of the things that gets you the television contracts and the exposure. So people complain, but you have to understand that we pay for this. The going rate for a game against what we call a cupcake is about $20,000. So when you start to make calls around, it's interesting what happens. It's not as if you invite these little teams in and you beat them by 40, 50 points, and then you say, thanks for coming, we hope you had a lot of fun, and we'll see you next year, we hope. So they get you on the other side of the phone call, and they say, we want a flight, we want a hotel, we want our meals, we'd like to go home with some extra pocket money if possible. And a lot of the small universities use that as a fundraising mechanism to help if they're not quite in the Big East, if they're in New Hampshire, if they're Vermont, or an Ivy League school, they can use the extra $20,000 or so. So being in charge of that's one of my duties. What I do is I grab this thing called the power rating. Now there's 294 Division I schools, and I'm looking at Marsha over there, she's a product of Iowa, so she's familiar with Division I. So of course I start at 294 and work back. So 294 this year happened to be Prairie View University. They were 0-27. So I thought I'd give them a call down in Texas. So I got the coach on the phone, and I said, would you be interested in coming up to Phoenix, Boston, New England, a lot of history, beautiful scenery and all this. And he says, well, son, he says, right now I got quite a bit of these yellow slips on my desk with plenty of potential opponents. So I know I'm in for it now. He's starting to make his pitch already. So I said, well, all right, what's it going to cost us? He says, $35,000. Now that's way out of our league. And then he goes on and says, well, that's not even including the $1,500 speaking engagement for me at your summer basketball camp. So all of a sudden, if they schedule 6 or 8 games, they make the program $200,000. He pockets $10,000 for himself. And I'm just trying to figure out how I'm going to introduce this guy, 0-27, from East Dust Texas, to our Jewish campus from Chestnut Hill, between the ages of 8, 9, 10 years old. So that's an example of one side of the business. And some of the teams we're playing next year, just to let you know, FDU, LIU. If you can guess what those schools actually are, I'll probably give you a couple free tickets to the game. And of course, a team like Harvard will bring in. So if you're not familiar with big-time athletics, that's one example of the way things work. Recruiting is the other scenario that you run into, and as much as we like to think of ourselves as being important as coaches, recruiting has become the most important thing. And the 294 Division I schools are all chasing probably the top 100 prospects nationwide. And it gets to be a circus. And the NCAA over the last few years has really tried to put in more rules and make it ethical as they can. But it's big business, like I said, and it's no different from the scams that go on in the savings and loan industry or on Wall Street. And they try to do the best they can as far as compliance, but it gets out of hand. And usually the first step for us is to go to camps and try to identify prospects. So we send out questionnaires. And you'll say, name and address and telephone number, and you get some amazing responses from these kids. One said there was sex, and the kid pushed down once. We had one that said father's occupation, and then father's school. And his father's occupation, this student put barber. And then father's school, we put Barbara School. So we go through the questionnaires and we try to identify if there's any connection to Boston, if they're interested in coming. We at BC try to look at the academic credentials as best we can. And that's the next problem. There's what they call a Prop 48 requirement, and that's a combination of a 2.0 grade point average, C average in 4 courses, and a combined 700 in the SAT. And if you can't qualify with that, you can still be accepted to the school, but you're ineligible for 1 year. And we at BC, it's pretty tough academically. We don't accept Proposition 48 kids. We won't accept them. And eventually they end up elsewhere in the league. And this year we had a situation where we recruited a star player from Philadelphia. And he made a verbal commitment to attend Boston College. It was kind of a coup for us. He was a big-time player. Now, he had taken the SATs 5 times, and he failed to get his combined 700. So finally we get a phone call one day from his lawyer, and he says, "I've got some good news and I have some bad news." So, so what's the good news? He said, he gets 700. And he said, "That's unbelievable. You got it, huh? What's the bad news?" And the lawyer said, "You got 700 in math." He got a combined 1360. Now, his best score that day was 660. So his 700-point increase was the highest in the history of the SAT. So his lawyer attributed it to one of these Stanley Kaplan courses. But it actually it was kind of hard for the people in Princeton, New Jersey, to believe that he actually pulled it off. And with further review, they found out that the student next to him happened to have just about an identical marking sheet, although his signature was on his test. They didn't catch him right-handed. So after dealing with that, our admissions people thought they'd forego that. And so right away Syracuse got on, and Miami got after him, and thank God he ended up at USC. So at least he's on the West Coast and got to deal with playing that. But these are some of the things that happen. When you go, then your next step is you try to set up visits. You want the student athlete to visit your school, and you want to go into their home. And there's a famous story about Jim Valvano, the famous coach from North Carolina State. He was a coach at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York. So he goes into this player's home in the deep south. He rings the doorbell, and they come to the door and he says, "Jim Valvano, Iona College." And the kid looks at his mom and says, "No, he owns his own school." Maybe he'll give us a dormitory. So that's the next step. You set up the visits, and we try to make Boston, as adorable as we can make it, and try to sell the school as best we can. I think one of the most amazing stories is that then you go on and you have the student athlete sign what's called a letter of intent. It's kind of a contract. It's not really legally binding. I think if students want to get out of it and hire lawyers and pursue it, they can probably be released of it. But it tells other schools to kind of lay off. This person is committed to this institution. And there was a famous story of Major Jones, the brother of Caldwell Jones, the famous NBA player. And he goes out to the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And everybody's heard about Nevada, Las Vegas. So he goes out there, and the first couple of days during registration, nobody has any record of him at all. He's supposed to be an incoming freshman, let alone a star basketball player. And he goes to try to get his books, no record. He tries to get his meal card, no record. He tries to get his room squared away, no record of him. So he goes to Terry Tarkanian, the coach, and he says, "Coach, there's absolutely no record of me, and no one's ever heard of me." And Coach Tarkanian looks at him and he says, "Major, you signed a 4-year scholarship with the University of Nevada, Reno, not the University of Nevada, Las Vegas." So he was at the wrong school. So once they squared that away, he was all set. But recruiting gets to be amazingly cutthroat. And again, like I talked to Steve, who works in the paper business, if you want to take shortcuts, you can get there faster, but the price of pay is high. And I think the other thing that you have to understand is that we just fought off at BC the Axe. They really had it out for the head coach, Jim O'Brien, who had 2 disastrous seasons. But you also have to realize that it was in the wake of a point shaving scandal back in the early 80s, and then a night school scandal, an academic scandal. So he comes in, and it takes 4 or 5 years to clean everything up. But while that's going on, the program is losing, and it's a constant catch-22. So thank God we won enough games and we kind of got out from under the axe. And I think now we've got a good program and things are definitely moving in the right direction. So I think we're doing it ethically as best we can, and we're trying to do it with good kids. And we've got some talent now finally. So beautiful facility helps, which is new, and that helps from a recruiting standpoint. And constant exposure, like now we're on ESPN, next year we're on CBS, and that will certainly help. But as much as I joke about the stories, and there are numerous funny stories, it's a socioeconomic situation, and the kids are from inner cities predominantly. They're from single-parent families, and it's sad actually that they've been pushed through public schools because they're star basketball players, or that they've come to exploit the system the way the system has exploited them. We have one star recruit that we signed this year, one of the best players in New York City, named Rob Blackwell. And Rob's a prize recruit from us. For us, he averaged about 20 points, 12 rebounds. He's considered one of the best players in New York City, and many consider him, as good as they come. And people don't realize that his father left the family when he was age 2, that his mother, Catherine, died of ovarian cancer when she was 11. When he was 10, actually. She had 11 kids, 6 youngsters that she left behind. His sister, Lynette, had 5 kids of her own. She was married at the time, and she took in the other 6. So there were 14 people living in a 2-room apartment in Brooklyn, New York. And Rob is an amazing kid who's wanted to get out of the city. Attended a Catholic high school with assistance, tuition assistance from one of the youth basketball leagues that he plays in. And he's kind of the other side of the coin. And it's kind of the refreshing side of the business. When, as cutthroat as it is, we're trying to provide some of the inner city kids with a great education. And if they can make it to the pros like John Bagsy or Dana Barrows or Michael Adams from Boston College, and that's terrific. But the vast majority of them won't get there. And lastly, I think that, when I think of Rob Blackwell's story, I'm reminded really of my mother who died of cancer in 1977, and my boss, Jimmy O'Brien, the head coach at BC, who lost his wife tragically last year to a heart attack at age 41. And when I started to think about the three of us, we're most fortunate because we've had loving support of our family. And we use basketball as a vehicle and the means to cope with adversity. And I think that's basically probably what sums this up for me, is that this dinner is, for me, a tribute to the Wakefield athletic family. And I really don't feel any different. I love my family. I love Sonny. I love Brad, Tony and his family. And Ernie Donahue, who's done as much as anybody has could ever dream of doing for the youngsters in Wakefield. And so, for me, athletics has been the means to travel and to getting a great education. And I know a lot of the older recipients of the Hall of Fame may have trouble understanding why it's such big business now and why we call it amateurism when maybe it really isn't. But the fact of the matter is it's Wakefield, and we fought through a lot of the cuts, and the programs are still there, and there's still people willing to volunteer their time. I go around and speak to a lot of youth basketball banquets, and it's like the time warp for me, because my dad ran the program in Wakefield for 30 years. And Johnny Shevlin was one of the first players, he tells me, at Dahlberg School when the league first started, and now there's 4 or 5 of his young kids that look like they're in that age bracket right now. So it's a cycle, and it seems to continue in Wakefield, and it seems to continue successfully. And it's a tribute to the volunteerism and the parents that put in time and try to work out the adverse situations. And I think sports is probably one of the best ways to do that. So thank you for inviting me, and congratulations to all the recipients. Some I know well, some I know as legends. And I'm looking forward to be back in Boston and attending next year. And it's nice to be home. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Great job. Just a brief intro before we start calling up the recipients tonight. Last year, we implemented a little sponsorship, so to speak, in that every recipient has a sponsor, whether it be a coach, a friend, a teammate, what have you. And so the actual awards will be presented by the sponsors tonight. To start things off, I'd like to call up Mr. Joe Saunders to present the award to Henry Rich.
Members of the selection committee, honored inductees, ladies and gentlemen. I graduated with the class of 1946 at Wakefield High School. In my class were two of the finest athletes in the school's history. One, a little left-hander already in your Hall of Fame, Lester Marco, who was the best baseball player with whom I ever played. The other was a neighbor of mine on Albion Street and my boyhood pal, Henry Hokey Rich. This young man was Lester Marco's battery mate on the baseball team, a basketball player of considerable ability, a truly gifted and great hockey center, and a triple threat back in football. I played high school hockey and baseball with Henry, and he was a good teammate as well as a good friend. In his high school career, he earned the astounding total of 12 varsity letters. Henry Rich was the finest running back of his day. He was selected for the All-Scholastic First Team and all 5 Boston papers of that time: the Globe, the Traveler, the American, the Record, and the Boston Post, which proclaimed him the paragon of high school backs. I recall 2 football games of that time with some clarity. As a junior against Watertown High School, Henry ran for more than 300 yards, and he scored 5 touchdowns on runs of more than 40 yards. To this day, that remains the finest individual performance I have ever seen by a Wakefield High School football player. As a senior, against Class A powerhouse Melrose, a team which Wakefield had not defeated for 23 years, and a team against whom Wakefield had not scored a touchdown in 13 years, Pokey, after suffering a severe injury to his knee, threw the touchdown pass and kicked a pressure-filled extra point, which accounted for the 7-6 victory by Wakefield over Melrose. Other than the celebration on VJ Day, there has never been a happier or larger turnout of townspeople than the one that late afternoon after that victory over Melrose. Henry at Arizona State College, whereas fullback, he averaged 7.2 yards per carry on offense, and as a free safety on defense, in 1950 he set a school and national record for pass interceptions with 12. He was drafted by the Philadelphia Eagles and played briefly with them for 2 years. Henry met his wife Dolores at Arizona State. They've been married for 41 years and have 4 children. He is now retired and lives in Fountain Hills, Arizona.
Henry Popey Rich was blessed with a great body and spirit. His father, Joe, his mother, Betty, his sister, Mary, and his brothers, Frankie and Joe, were all good people who were justly filled with pride over his exceptional athletic prowess. Henry Popey Rich ran with power and he ran with grace. In my view, he was the most graceful running back I ever saw. No athlete who attended Wakefield High School merits the honor of selection to the Hall of Fame more than the great Henry Rich. All of us are gratified that you have recognized the best player of this time. It's now my honor to introduce Henry Rich.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. As Joe just mentioned, much of the body has deteriorated, but the spirit is still there. And for this committee here to do what you've done in formulating this particular program, my congratulations to you. I also want to recognize the people who are not great associates of mine, Red Zanotto and Jim Landerby. They were great athletes, wonderful athletes, and I'm sure you kids are very proud. I'd also like to congratulate this young man right over here, Steve Berkholz, for his tremendous communications on this. And also, I'd like to express my proudness, of course, to be included among all the other inductees this evening. You're champions, and you'll always remain champions. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Oh, one thing that, my God, I never lived this down. I'd like to introduce my wife, Dolores. I'd also like to recognize and call upon him just to stand a dear old friend of mine by the name of Arthur Moncrief, who years ago during my high school days had tutored me in algebra. So he thought. But he also had two very beautiful daughters. And I'll tell you what an enticement that was. Art, would you stand up and so people can see? Again, thank you very much. And and another thing too. You see, I came fully prepared for this speech, you know. I do want to thank, in other words, this is the first opportunity that I've ever had to thank the townspeople for all the support that they had given us during my high school days. And I'm sure there are many associates, former teammates here that would agree that townspeople were just terrific. Keep it up.
Next up tonight is Ronnie Walsh. She's going to be presenting Karen Sorensen Henry with her award.
I'm really pitch hitting for Jean Nichols, who is the real sponsor for Karen Sorensen Henry. And I'd like to read her remarks. First, let me extend a greeting to the guests at the head table, to the student athletes, parents, friends, and coaches, and to all others in attendance this evening. I am truly sorry that I was unable to travel to Wakefield for this year's induction ceremony. I am pleased and proud to sponsor Karen Sorensen Henry as an inductee this year. I first met Karen as a 7th grader at Wakefield Junior High, I won't mention the year, when I was teaching physical education fresh out of college. Karen participated in every after-school sports activity we offered, from soccer to gymnastics, from basketball to track. She became active in our girls' sports club in the 7th grade and was organizing and leading it by the 8th grade. Perhaps her greatest contribution to the junior high PE program was the role she played as a student leader. Student leaders were a highly qualified select group of 8th grade boys and girls who assisted us as teachers in setting up equipment, leading warm-ups, conducting various drills, and officiating in class games. Karen clearly stands out in my memory as one of the very best young leaders. To have been an effective leader to youngsters just one year her junior demanded a high degree of maturity and self-confidence, in addition to the gift of extraordinary motor skills, which she's being honored this evening. My association with Karen continued through her high school years, during which time she completed in gymnastics, in track, and field. As her head coach in gymnastics for 4 years, I was able to observe other qualities worth praising. Her tenacity and will to succeed both as an individual as well as a team member were most impressive. In a sport that, by its very nature, demands self-reliance, Karen was the type of athlete, and I suspect still is the type of person, who never made excuses for herself. She accepted the challenge of the difficult and sometimes monotonous work of gymnastics training and took responsibility for her own performances, whether good or bad. Karen's leadership qualities surfaced again in high school, where as co-captain of the gymnastic team, she contributed significantly to the development of new team members. Never selfish or demanding, Karen was the type of athlete that keeps coaches in the coaching business. As I reflect back on experiences of our gymnastic days, I realize that tonight represents one more occasion, albeit 13 years later, for which I have felt a great sense of pride in Karen, this time for being honored as an inductee into the Hall of Fame. I too feel honored to be your sponsor for this event, and more importantly, to have been associated with you as your teacher and coach. Congratulations. Karen?
Good evening. I'm really happy to be here. I'm very proud to be here. All the way from Nashville, Tennessee, y'all. That's where I currently live, and I hate to admit I'm not embarking on a country music career, but just living there. But I'd like to thank Ronnie for filling in. It was wonderful to rekindle a friendship with Jean Nichols because of this whole program. I saw her, she was inducted last year, and that's how I tracked her down. So that was great to rekindle that friendship. But unfortunately, she couldn't be here, so I'd like to thank Ronnie for pitching in because Paula was going to be here tonight, but couldn't be. I'd like to thank Harry Krause also for being my liaison and keeping track of me in Nashville and through my sister. I'd like to thank my sister also. She nominated me, Sonia Sorensen Fuller, so she started the process. And this is quite an honor, and it was at a time when women's sports were just starting to get noticed in the world. Olga Korbut and Nadia Comaneci, and so this is dedicated to all the women athletes of the past, the ones currently struggling, and to all those for the future. Thank you very much.
Next up, I'd like to call George Landrigan to present to Jim Landrigan, just to make the speech for his father.
Well, it's with great pleasure that I'm here with my mother and my wife to have my brother presented into the Hall of Fame. As so many of you knew Jim was a great guy. He was not only a good athlete, he was a very fine person. He was a good student, always had time for his friends, made friends easily, always had really time for everyone. He was not only good in football, but also in, of course, hockey. He was also very good in track. As some of you may remember, he held the shot put record for over 23 years. But one of the things that I remember so well of that Coach Healy said about Jim, he was one hell of a tough athlete, but he was always a gentleman. Played hard, hit hard, but always did it right. And I know that somewhere in the great beyond that Jim's up there looking down and saying, well, thanks so much for tonight, because he really deserves to be there. Thank you very much.
Next, I'd like to call up Dan Blanchard to present the award to Barry Curley.
Steve Burkholz, members of the Hall of Fame Committee, honored guests, and friends. I am so pleased to be here this evening. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure whether I'm more excited about this than perhaps Barry is, but a year ago I attended the first induction of the Hall of Fame in this very location, and primarily that was to be in support of my good friend and colleague Sonny Lane. He was inducted, but I kept the program. This is last year's. I kept the program because I hoped that maybe someday or some year I should have the honor of presenting the all-time greatest tennis player to ever play for Wakefield High School. So that's why I'm so excited to be here tonight, because I'm here to do just that. I'm also excited because the sport of tennis is being recognized. Tennis is one of those wonderful sports that you can play for a lifetime, and yet sometimes in the past it was difficult for tennis to get equal billing, let's say, with some of the other more attention-grabbing headline sports. But during the mid to late 1970s, tennis began to attract some outstanding athletes. Peter Johnson was an outstanding athlete in track and cross country during the other seasons, but he played tennis in the spring. Mark Kumpel, a star in soccer and hockey, chose to play tennis in the spring. I think of Jim Fitzgerald and our very own Rick Voyages, who spoke earlier this evening, to mention just a few. But Barry Curley was the centerpiece. He was the one pure tennis player that we had. Now, prior to 1975, Wakefield tennis was kind of down and out. In fact, wins were about as rare as Red Sox pennants. Well, maybe not quite that rare, but close. The program was kind of stagnant. And in my first year in 1974, we were blessed with some real super kids who struggled and gave it everything, and somehow we came out with a winning season. But all through that year, there were whispers around town, wait till you see this 8th grader. His name's Barry Curley, just wait till you get him next year. And I recall one day we were practicing down at Betts Field, because that was before the high school courts were ready to open. And we were practicing one afternoon, and someone said, there he is. I said, there who is? He said, that's him. That's Barry, pointing to the skinny little 5-footer who was standing outside the fence watching us. I said, that's Barry Curley? That's Barry Curley I've been hearing about? Well, you're going to find it hard to believe when you see him tonight, because he's a pretty strapping young man. But in the 8th grade, Barry Curley was a peanut. So I wasn't quite ready to proclaim us world beaters just yet. But over that summer, Barry began to handle some of the veterans in town tournaments, and it was clear that he was someone special. So in the spring of 1975, 24 players reported to the first practice. Now, you know, in tennis, there's no doubt who's number one, because you have to prove it on the court. So after an appropriate deference to some of the veterans on the squad, it was time to set up some challenge matches. And by opening day, Barry Curley was indeed established as number 1. And for 4 years, he never played a position other than first singles, which is the spot reserved for the best player on the team. Now, that's almost unheard of. In fact, I can't think of anyone at Wakefield or other schools in the area that have played, a single person has played first singles for all of his matches for 4 years. It's very unusual. Barry's 4-year record reads 48-14-1, plus, as you see in on your program, a 3-1 record in team tournament play, so he had over 50 wins altogether. He was our MVP 3 times, selected by the coaches of the Middlesex League to be League All-Star 3 times, and of course he was captain during his senior year, the captain of the most successful team in Wakefield tennis history. Barry's senior year was 1978, a year noted for 2 things: the blizzard and Wakefield High assuming a prominent place on the high school tennis map of eastern Massachusetts. So this team that was mired in futility a few years earlier was now sporting a record of 15-3 and seeded 4th in the state tournament. And as I stated, Barry was the centerpiece of that team. There were others of note, though, on the team. In fact, Barry, I have to tell you, you're not the first to be inducted into this Hall of Fame. Mark Kumpel, who played second doubles, beat you last year, but that was for hockey. Our very own Steve Burkholz was a member of that team, now the coach of Wakefield High School tennis and our master of ceremonies this evening. And of course, so was Ricky Boyages. Finally, let me just tell you a couple of things about Barry as a person, aside from the statistics, because he was a great young man to coach. But I do recall a couple of anecdotes that I want to share. One was his very first match of his career, and Barry's private coach arrived. That's right, private coach, on the Farm Street courts alongside. And after the first set, when coaches are allowed to speak with their players, Barry went to talk to his private coach. Well, you know, tennis is a little bit different than some sports because it's a team sport, but you play it individually on the court. So a high school tennis coach's job, or a very big part of it, is to build a team. So while the other guy knew, I'm sure, a million times more than I did as far as the techniques of forehands and backhands, I figured that there was only room for one coach on match days. And so when the match was over, I got a hold of Barry and I said, nay, you tell that character that your only responsibility is to me on match days. Well, I'm going to ask him later tonight, but I never found out what Barry told him, but I never saw the guy again. And Barry was wise enough to realize that situation. Interspersed around the team season is a singles tournament. And during his junior year, Barry won 4 rounds, meaning he could advance beyond the regionals to the final 16. I guess we'd call them the Sweet 16 today of the state. And every year the final 16 played for the championships in Brockton. Well, taking a little historic liberty, I said one day that Barry had made it to Mecca, meaning that we joined the annual pilgrimage to the Mecca of Eastern Mass tennis. Well, to my statement, which I think appeared in the item, Barry said the next day, "Gee, Coach, I thought we were going to Brockton. Where's Mecca?" Mrs. Curley appreciated that story tonight. I think Barry's greatest single moment on the courts came on the clay in Winchester. It was late in his senior year, and Barry was playing Reese Thomas. Now, Thomas was ranked number 2 in New England, 2 in New England, and held a national ranking as well. And Barry was determined to beat him. And the first set, he was awesome, winning 6-1, the first set that Thomas had lost all season. Second set wasn't quite so easy, as Reese was fighting for his life, and he knew he was in trouble. The set progressed to a tiebreaker at 6-6. That's tennis's version of overtime. And Barry won the final point for a 5-4 tiebreaker win in the match. It was Reese's only loss in 4 years in league play, a real dramatic and satisfying win for Barry. So this young man was a leader by example. He was dedicated, hardworking, just a super person to work with. And at a time when some tennis players disgrace themselves by abusing their opponents and throwing their rackets and defaming their own reputation, Barry was always the gentleman, and that to me was always much more important than the wins and losses. So it's my very great pleasure and pride to present to you this evening Mr. Barry Curley.
Thank you, Dan. That was a hell of a speech. I don't remember half of that stuff. It's nice to be reminded of it once in a while. I currently live in Ponte Vedra, Florida, and just up here for this event. This is really, this is awesome for me. It's nice to be remembered. Wakefield was a place that I never, ever got anywhere near the recognition that I did anywhere else other than Wakefield. We had writers like Bud Cohane who would, he would write bigger articles than anything else in the paper, and he'd describe every single point I ever played, and I got to the point where I even got bored reading my own stuff. Let's get back to Ricky here for a minute. Ricky, that was certainly a nice thing he said about me. And I remember a different incident, which I'd like to set the record straight. There we were in the quarterfinals, me and my sister in mixed doubles, and as Ricky remembered it, the ball hit on the line, and I called it out. As I remember, you did choke, Ricky. The ball never went over the net. I probably would have called it out, but it never came over. And after the match, as he shook hands, he said, "I'm taking up basketball." And the rest there is history. Now, seriously though, some people have been really influential in my tennis career, I guess you'd say, is guys like Steve Donahue. When Steve's here. How about a little round of applause for Steve? Steve was the kind of guy who, when I was a kid, a little snot-nosed kid with a foul mouth or whatever, Steve would go out of his way to help me out and give me any kind of tennis knowledge that he knew, and would hang around me, a little 12-year-old kid, when it wasn't exactly the cool thing to do, and would help me along in my tennis endeavors. And I guess he's still kind of playing that same role, only a different place at Kent State now. And he's the kind of guy that made Wakefield the kind of place that it was for a tennis player to grow up. I appreciate that. Guys like Dan Blanchard, who always, you talk about a coach that bent over backwards, totally went out of his way. Those are the kind of things that not only helped me to become a tennis player at a high school level, but kept me going through college, and now I make my living as a tennis pro in Jacksonville, Florida. So I'd just like to thank the town and everybody involved. It was a great community support for me as a kid growing up, and it's nice to come back and see. I've moved away and haven't seen half of these people here in 15 years, or maybe it's even longer than that. It's nice to come back and see where it all started. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to call up Mr. Paul Wheeler to present an award to Joe Zanota Jr.
Members of the Select Committee, honored inductees, ladies and gentlemen, it was a very pleasant and nostalgic trip going back 40, 50, and 60 years ago to get this information about my friend Red Zanota. And reflecting back 40, 50, and 60 years ago, it was relatively easy. And I saw a bumper sticker that sort of made me smile just recently. It said, "Things get better as they get older. I must be approaching magnificence." So as we get older, that's a pleasant thought. First of all, let me thank Billy Cullen and Foster Cummings for their help in getting this information. They played with Red in the 1941-42 hockey team. They were Red's line mates. I want to thank Ed Zip Zagaya, Red's cousin. He gave me a great deal of information. Gave me a little quiz I'm going to give to you in just a moment also. Also from the Wakefield item, they were great help and gave me a great deal of information, a lot of aid, and there was Bobby Dahlberg, Larry O'Brien, John Tredenick, and Peter Rossi. And thank you very much. Here's the quiz that Eddie Zagaya gave to me to pose to you people. You don't know the answer, obviously. I had an idea. He indicated to me that in the early 40s there were 5 young men in this area, 1 in Lynn, 4 in Wakefield. They were all excellent athletes. The man in Lynn, the young man in Lynn, his name was Price. And the 4 in Wakefield, one was Johnny Quay, a terrific athlete. The next one was Zip Zagaya. We called him Zip because he was just an excellent track man. He could run the 440 like nobody else in our time. Larry Botnick, perhaps the best athlete I had seen in high school, and a guy named Red Zanota. These 4 fellas came from Wakefield. The 5 of them had something in common. And the something in common is each of their mothers' names was Gorski. There were 5 Gorski girls that came from Poland. They settled down here and their offspring were terrific athletes. Red was one of them, of course. Zip told me that the Gorski girls got their courage because they lived on the Russian border in Poland. They got their speed because they ran like hell when the tanks came. But whatever, that was a common thread amongst these 5 outstanding athletes. Red Zanota was born in the mid-20s and he grew up through the Great Depression of the 30s. And there were a great many different things, of course, in the 30s than we have today. And one of the things that I've got to bring to mind is the climate. We had a different climate in the wintertime. And we used to have a lot of ice, where now we don't have much ice. We used to have a lot of skating. And the young fellas, we used to go down to the lake and you could watch men chopping up the ice and putting it in the ice house to sell for the rest of the summer. It was 12, 15, 18 inches thick. We had it 4 months of the year. I recall skating on a Thanksgiving Day. But we had a great deal of ice in those days, so the climate was different, and Red took full advantage of that. He was a terrific hockey player. He also skated down at the end of Fitch Court in a little pond that they had down there. The Wakefield High School hockey teams, prior to Red being on there, used to practice on the lake. We can't conceive of that now, but they did. And they played every game outdoors, no natural ice. But in the 1941-42 season, when Red was a sophomore, Wakefield High School was admitted to the Eastern Mass League for the first time. And I have some information here from 2 of Red's teammates. One of them, Foster Cummings, and he wrote to me when I asked him for information. I can't recall instantly back in the specifics of it. And Foster wrote to me, he said, in the hockey 41-42 season, Frank Dinan, coach, originally played Red as a defenseman, but later switched him to the center of the second line with Bert Strong and Al Thresher. Partway through the season, the coach shifted Red to the first line with Bill Cullen and me. These moves gave more physical capability to the first line. This team won the Eastern Mass League that year. And Red was the leading scorer. He was an all-star. I recall the story Buddy Vitito told me. Doc Mooney was a very well-known sports writer for the Boston Post in those days. He was also a referee. And he was outside the Wakefield dressing room one night, and he said that Red was the best player in the league. And Buddy Vitito, who was the goalie for the team, said to Doc, he's only a sophomore. And Doc Mooney couldn't believe it. But Red was a sophomore. He led the league in scoring. He was all-star, and he certainly was an outstanding athlete. Billy Cullen sent me along an article that I never could have gotten. In his collection of articles, it's a picture of the first Wakefield High School hockey team. It was in the Daily Item, published in 1966. First Wakefield High School hockey team.